ناوی من جیهر گوڵە من خەڵکی سنەم شارێکی لە ڕۆژهەڵاتی کوردستان.
Which means?
My name is Jihar Gol. I am from a city in eastern Kurdistan.
Kurdish has got 4 different dialects. That's Sorani, Kurmanji, Kalhuri, and Orami. And these populations are scattered throughout the whole region, in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey.
The Kurds are one of the largest ethnic groups in the world without a country of their own. Like other problems in the Middle East, this one also has its roots in the early 20th century, when the empires of the day drew up the map of the region as we know it.
With the end of World War I, the Western powers had actually promised the Kurds an independent state.
The Kurdish struggle for self-determination has been bloody, both for them and those on the receiving end of their fight.
This fighting has caused the loss of at least 40,000 lives in Turkey, and up to 3 million people were forcibly displaced, according to statistics.
Now, after decades of violence, the largest Kurdish militant group might just be prepared to lay down arms. In February, Abdullah Ocalan, the imprisoned leader of the Kurdistan Workers Party, known as the PKK, released a jaw-dropping written message to his followers from his island jail.
PKK kendini feshetmelidir.
The letter said the PKK had lost its meaning, and that all groups must lay down their arms and the PKK must dissolve itself.
Will this end in a new era of peace for the Kurds? Or is it just another turn in a tortured history? In this series, we explore the Kurdish issue, the persecution, the resistance, and the attempts to form a state. We ask, what does the future hold for the tens of millions of Kurds in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran? I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig, and this is the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring, where we look at the world through the lens of its media, exploring the narratives, the propaganda, and the disinformation.
Радио Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
조중 두당 두 나라 최고 영도자 동지들께서는
To understand the magnitude of Öcalan's announcement and what effect it might have on the geopolitical map of the region, we need to get the context, who the Kurds are and what they've been fighting for. Our colleague from BBC Persian, Jihar Gol, a Kurd himself, will introduce us to the Kurdish worldview.
The Kurds are one of the oldest nations in Mesopotamia. There's 2 ancient rivers. They start from the Kurdish region in Turkey. They cross through the Kurdish region in Syria, all the way to the Kurdish region in Iraq to the Persian Gulf. It's a cradle of civilization. But in the past 100 years or so, obviously they've been divided between 4 nations. There's an estimate over 40 million Kurds in Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq.
Many of them live in small towns like that of our monitoring colleague Sarbas Nazari, a Kurd who grew up in Iran.
I was born in Pawe, which is a small town in Iranian Kurdistan close to the Iraqi border. It's one of the most ancient spots. If you have a look at the city, it's like a massive ladder. The homes are built on the slopes of the mountains, which gives it a very unique picture. And most of the inhabitants of the town are still wearing the Kurdish clothes and dressing, and everything is just the same as it has been like thousands of years ago. It's about the culture, the way we dress, the way we speak, our cuisine. But most notably, I would say it's the shared and common aspirations for statehood, for identity, which remains unaddressed, remains unachieved for centuries. Something that you face from the very early stages of your life in Iran. It's the refusal of the ruling establishment to recognize you, your culture, your language, your rituals. Most of the Kurds under the Islamic Republic are considered by default as rebels, as separatists. It always follows you and you feel like you're being alienated in your own home country. And that probably explains why the Kurds have always been trying to fight although this fight has always been repeatedly repressed violently.
Notice some of the key words from these Kurdish perspectives: struggle, repression, suffering. The country where that Kurdish struggle for independence began 100 or so years ago is Turkey. Dilay Yalcin from our Istanbul team is an expert on the subject.
Kurds make up 15 to 20 million of Turkey's population, which means up to 1 in 5 people in Turkey are Kurdish. And they have historically lived in the east and southeast of the country, the area which borders Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Kurds were a major part of the independence war in Turkey. And according to some academics, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, has said that Kurds should be given some sort of autonomy prior to the foundation of the Republic.
Atatürk was smarter, I think, and he said the Kurds have been with us, we have been fighting, we respect them, they are part of us. Somehow they managed, with a stroke of pen, to dissolve the treaty.
The stroke of pen GR refers to was the abandoning of the Treaty of Sèvres, which promised to carve out several new nations from the carcass of the Ottoman Empire, including a Kurdish one. But it was a new Turkish state, led by Atatürk, that would take its place on the map, formalized by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. These post-war developments left millions of Kurds divided between 4 new Middle Eastern nations. One of them is Syria, and here's Florence Dixon from our Middle East team.
Syria is actually a country made up of minorities. The Kurds are the largest non-Arab minority. They're thought to be around 1 million people, centred around 3 areas all along the northern border with Turkey, the border that cut right through the historical region of Kurdistan. So you have Afrin, Kobani, and then a more spread out area in what's called Jazira, and Qamishli, that's known as Rojava, which effectively means Western Kurdistan.
It's not just the terrain they inhabit that varies. The Kurds are a diverse group of people.
The Kurdish community in Syria is not homogenous. It's majority Sunni and majority Sufi Muslims, but you have Yazidis, you have Alawite Kurds, Zoroastrians. And the Kurdish identity, it was localized around family and tribal structures.
Last but not least on this whistle-stop tour of the Kurdish areas is Iraq. Mohammed Al-Jumaili from our Middle East team will guide us through it.
The history of Kurds in Iraq goes back decades. Kurdish population in Iraq is about 15 to 20% of the population. They're mainly concentrated in northern Iraq. The 4 main provinces are Erbil, Suleymaniya, Dahak, and Halabja.
It is the Iraqi Kurds who have arguably achieved the highest level of autonomy among the 4 nations. We'll look into it in more detail in part 2. As for what these different groups of Kurds would want, the answer varies from basic rights to full independence.
In general, what most of these Kurdish opposition groups and activists are seeking is self-determination, the right to practice your culture, your language, your religion, and to enjoy some basic rights. An independent Kurdish state would be unrealistic, given all the calculations and so many factors into play with 4 governments involved. These 4 states, despite all their differences, when it comes to the matter of the Kurdish independence, they suddenly become united, and because they have a common enemy, and that is the future of the Kurds as an independent state. That's why the struggle has repeatedly failed over the time.
Let's go back to Turkey and the Treaty of Lausanne, the one that recognized the outline of the modern Turkish state and planted the seeds of a decades-long conflict.
The Kurds have rebelled against the Turkish state from the very early days of the Republic, and these rebellions were suppressed very violently.
There has been a conflict and struggle for their rights and identity. For example, in Turkey, until very recently, speaking Kurdish was a crime. In 1991, Leyla Zana, the Kurdish MP, elected to the parliament, When she took her oath in Turkish, in the end of her oath, she said few words in Kurdish. She said, I promise I will fight for democracy and equality for Kurds and brotherhood between Kurds and Turks. That was enough for her to put on trial. As she was convicted to life in prison. Took 12 years to be released from prison. So that was a kind of environment, particularly in Turkey.
Although the ban on speaking non-Turkish languages was lifted in 1991, Kurdish never became an official language.
We could maybe refer to this 1930 secret Interior Ministry circular sent to governors' offices across the country, which actually challenged the clothes, the songs, dances, and traditions of the Kurdish society, quote unquote, as bad, harmful, base, and primitive.
Repression and conflict have been a pattern repeated across the region. Let's move east across the border with Iran.
After the 1979 revolution, Ruhollah Khomeini ordered an offensive in Kurdish areas where many villages and towns were destroyed and attacked and hundreds of people executed. And the Kurds recognized the fact that this regime will not tolerate any opposition, and they refer to it as I'm using the Kurdish term, Hukumati Siyadara, or a state which is obsessed with executions, sending people to the gallows.
Likewise, the expression of Kurdish identity was met with a violent pushback in Syria.
Nation-states in the Middle East were being formed around Arab nationalism. So by default, by definition, that excluded Kurds from the nation building that was happening in Syria. You actually had Kurds coming in from Turkey in around 1920 who were fleeing the crackdown, who are thought to have brought this idea of Kurdish nationalism to the long-standing community in Syria. In the 1960s, this kind of Kurdish political awakening happened. At the same time, you had the rise of the Ba'ath Party, which is specifically nationalist and Arab socialist. This really emphasized Syria's Arab identity and cracked down on any expression of Kurdish identity. The Kurdish language was banned, Nowruz, Kurdish New Year, was banned. Any kind of Kurdish music, cultural expressions had to go underground, as did a kind of burgeoning political movement. A census taken in 1962 in Hasaka province saw Kurds who couldn't prove their residence in Syria before 1945 stripped of their citizenship. They became stateless, they became unable to travel, unable to vote, unable to own property or businesses, unable to legally marry or get any government jobs. And there's a really dark history of what happened to these stateless Kurds, who at the time numbered around 120,000, and then by 2011 they were estimated between 300 and 500,000. They were marginalised and abused by the regime.
Things get darker still as we move on to Iraq.
In terms of political struggle against Baghdad, it became more prominent in the 40s with the Kurdish rebellions. And then the 60s and 70s is really where you saw Iraqi Kurdish wars against Baghdad's central rule. These are quite brutal conflicts. And that culminated really during the Iran-Iraq war.
It was during that war that the biggest atrocity against the Kurds happened towards the conflict's end in 1988.
Kurdish groups collaborated together to wage an uprising against Saddam Hussein with support from Iran during the war. That culminated in the Enfel campaign, which is described as a genocide by many scholars, NGOs, and Kurds themselves as well. Most estimates range between 100 to 200,000 Kurds were killed during this campaign. And within that was the Halabja chemical attack, the largest chemical attack against the civilian population.
The reverberations of Saddam's attack on Halabja were felt across the border in Iran too, where Sarbas lived.
When I was just 7 years old, there were hundreds of people who crossed the border into my hometown after the chemical bombardment of the town of Halabja. They were sheltered by the Iranian Kurds for months. I remember at least 30 to 40 people in our place actually living with us, and we were sharing food, we were sharing everything. That's quite symbolic of the affinity that the Kurds have and indicates that borders don't matter here.
Saddam's repression would not hold the Iraqi Kurds back for long.
The thing that really epitomizes for many Kurds the relationship with Baghdad and this kind of fear that we'll have another Enfel again. And that was very apparent in 1991. After the first Gulf War, Kurds in the north, as well as Shias in the south of Iraq, saw an opportunity to rise up against Saddam. He's badly weakened and is well encouraged by calls from the US to rise up.
And that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands, to force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside.
In the north, Erbil, Suleimania, Dahaq fell under Kurdish control before Iraqi forces regrouped and retook those territories. Hundreds of thousands of Kurds fled to northern Iraq into the mountains.
In the north, where government troops appear to have retaken the city of Erbil, an even greater tragedy may be unfolding. There are reports of the largest ever movement of Kurds. The BBC's Jim Muir is in Erbil.
Hundreds of thousands of Kurds are now on the move, cramming their families and whatever they could carry into lorries, tractor trailers, cars, taxis.
And yeah, there was real fear of reprisal attacks from the Iraqi government. In response to that, the US implemented a no-fly zone. That kind of stopped Saddam in his tracks and essentially secured that area and allowed Kurds to have their breathing space. That's kind of the start of their autonomy, really.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. While the Gulf War, with the help of the US, created this opening for the Kurds in Iraq, over in Turkey, the government was conducting major operations against the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers Party. In many Kurdish areas, danger was never too far. Dilay has gathered testimonies from residents in Diyarbakir.
I asked one very prominent Kurdish academic, Cuma Çiçek, how he would describe what life was like when he was growing up in the southeast. He said, especially for the 1990s, there was fear everywhere. Everybody in the household had to be back at home by the sunset. And this was because anything could happen to you after sunset in Diyarbakir. The situation was even worse in other provinces. These were years when people were being shot on the street. There were forced disappearances. Your son would go to work and never show up again. And there are people in Turkey, there are mothers, fathers, siblings who are still looking for at least the bones of their relatives because they have disappeared without a trace.
Turkey justified its crackdown on Kurdish areas by proscribing the PKK as a terrorist organization, a designation repeated by the US, the EU, and others.
There were a lot of state policies, security, quote-unquote, policies in Kurdish regions. One of them was displacing Kurds. And then there was the system of the village guards, which were selected from among the Kurdish citizens. And the Kurds were facing a decision between joining the village guards and being threatened by the PKK, or supporting the PKK and being threatened by the Turkish state.
The village guards are local armed militias, mostly made up of Kurds, supposed to protect their communities against PKK attacks. This system was introduced by Ankara, and it put many residents between a rock and a hard place.
If you look at the long history of the Kurds, particularly in the past 100 years, they have allied with many countries in the region, but in the end, they were left alone with their mountains. All those Kurdish fighters, in the eyes of the Kurds, freedom fighters, in the eyes of those countries who don't like them, terrorists, separatists, mountains have been a place of retreat, a place of go there, regroup, and fight back.
If there's one figure that looms large throughout the Kurdish struggle, it's that of the jailed PKK leader Abdullah Ocalan, known as Apo, or Uncle, to his followers.
Despite his imprisonment for now more than 26 years, Öcalan has been regarded as the leader of the movement by the Kurdish people. From the diaspora in Europe to the autonomous region in northern Syria, you'll see posters of Öcalan wherever there are Kurds.
A burly man with a thick moustache beaming a wide smile from those posters, Öcalan became a father figure for millions of Kurds with an outsized influence over their fate. Just how did he become so powerful?
The 1970s in Turkey were times of massive student movements. Öcalan was part of this movement. He founded the Marxist-Leninist PKK with his friends, and they were seeing Turkey as a colonizer of the Kurdish region. After the 1980 military coup against these student movements, the Kurdish dissidents were treated much more harshly in prisons compared to Turkish dissidents. Several reports and testimonies saying that Kurds were tortured with outrageous methods in prisons in those years. And it is said that this is part of the reason why the PKK decided to take up arms against the Turkish state.
Besides his Kurdish nationalism and Marxist-Leninist principles, Öcalan brought something highly unusual to his manifesto, a feminist element that elevated the position of women in society, striking because it arose from a deeply conservative rural Anatolia.
Perhaps one of the most important aspects of this ideology is what he has called genealogy. Genealogy basically means women's science. It's a major principle of Öcalan's thought.
There is a clip of him in 1975. He says, in order to liberate our society, we need to liberate our women. There is no way you can bring about change in the society without women leading this movement. Women had a 50-50 role.
He believes that patriarchy is very deeply linked to the state oppression and to capitalism. His ideas have inspired women's movements from across the borders. And that's why we have seen women fighters joining the YPG to fight against the Islamic State, for example.
We'll come back to the female warriors of the YPJ that struck terror into the hearts of Islamic State militants in our next episode. For women, the path to integrating as equals wasn't straightforward, whether in Syria or in the PKK.
And of course, women has to, even within that organization, fight for their rightful place because the men mentality didn't allow that. How on earth a woman could tell me what to do? I have been fighting. There was a struggle like that. PKK is ideologically driven. There's a celibacy. There's no relation between men and women. From the moment they join the PKK, they completely disconnect connection with their families. Their family is their comrade, their friends.
What those armed comrades fought for was to upend the status quo.
1983 manifesto has said that the organization would lead a Kurdistan revolution to end Turkey's domination of the Kurdish region of Turkey. And the PKK started attacking Turkish security forces.
Ankara'da TUSAŞ'ta bir terör saldırısı gerçekleşti.
The fighting has continued for over 40 years now, on and off. Some 40,000 people have died in the conflict from both sides, and up to 3 million people have been displaced. So it has had a huge effect on both Turkish and Kurdish society.
There is no precise breakdown for the death toll, but Kurdish activists insist that it is largely Kurdish civilians who have borne the brunt of the conflict as Turkish army operations swept through their villages. The list of attacks by the PKK is long too, and for a period of time, they were daily news.
They attacked the Turkish army, and thousands of Turkish soldiers have lost their lives in this conflict. Bombings would happen in Istanbul and continued fighting in the mountains of the southeast of Turkey and then later in northern Iraq. So this has caused the loss of thousands of lives. And obviously, Öcalan has been considered a terrorist from day one. And the PKK members, the executive board, they're all considered terrorists. Even pro-Kurdish political party members, MPs, are considered terrorists because the government accuses them of having direct links with the PKK.
Sorgusunda PKK, PYD, YPG terör örgütü tarafından...
We grew up with these reports on TVs every day, every night. They are designated as a terrorist organization by Turkey, the EU, and the US because of all this.
Needless to say, the counterinsurgency had a devastating impact on Kurdish areas.
The fighting between the PKK and Turkish government took a huge toll on Kurdish families across the country. In every household, you have at least one death, somebody up in the mountains, someone who was forcibly disappeared. There's no Kurdish household in Turkey that has not been affected by the fighting.
There's an interesting detail about the landscape in Kurdish areas that tells a story of pain, grief, and personal loss.
Turkey's Kurdish region is swamped with satellite dishes because the PKK's TV channels can only be viewed through those dishes. And every household has or had at least one member who went to fight with the PKK. And the satellite dishes and the TV channels of the PKK were the only sources of information for people who had relatives up in the mountains.
Despite the losses, the PKK's reach and influence extends to Kurds far beyond Turkey's borders.
PKK has certainly the most influence in Syria and on Iranian Kurds. Iraqi Kurdistan is quite different. They have a certain level of freedom there. People really doesn't feel they need armed organization to come to liberate them. But I think in Iran, we have a political party called PKK, which is pretty much following the ideology of the PKK. In Syria, exactly they're following the Öcalan ideology.
In Iran, Kurdish militancy has long given way to political opposition.
They're more experienced, they're more organized, they have had political parties for nearly 80 years. And yes, there are still armed groups, but they're not as active as they were. They're seeking to materialize the rights of the Kurds through other means than violence.
While his ideology traveled far, Öcalan was living on borrowed time, moving around from country to country to evade capture.
In 1999, he went to Russia and then to Greece, and then he went to Italy. Nobody would accept him. But you may be surprised, at the time, Nelson Mandela offered him asylum. So he was on his way to South Africa.
He was caught in Nairobi by Turkish intelligence officials. And he was arrested and sent to the İmralı Island prison off the coast of Istanbul. It's basically an island with only a prison on top of it and a lot of security. So he has been serving an aggravated life sentence there for 26 years now.
Alone in his island jail, Öcalan still exerted a commanding influence over the PKK and would change the movement's goals entirely.
He abandoned that idea of a nation state. He said, you cannot impose one group over others. He came up with these democratic communities. Every small section of society or village or a town should have a say in their future. And then PKK abandoned that idea of having an independent Kurdistan.
Yet something was changing in Ankara too.
In 2005, Erdogan became the first Turkish prime minister to recognize the Kurdish issue. He said in a speech in Diyarbakır that year, "The Kurdish issue is my issue."
Kürt sorunu da bu milletin bir parçasının değil, hepsinin sorunudur. Benim de sorunumdur.
Öcalan picked up on the favorable wind and initiated peace talks from his prison cell.
He sent a message for ceasefire, and President Erdogan, to his credit, promised to solve it. But in 2013, he felt he's losing in opinion poll. Among the Turkish nationalists, he shelved the negotiation. And unfortunately, the war began, and many lives have been lost since then.
Then came elections, and the new face of Kurdish politics emerged.
Selahattin Demirtas has become the second most prominent Kurdish politician or human rights activist. the very young leader of the pro-Kurdish party. He quickly became admired by Turks and Kurds alike for his wit and humor.
Kürt halkı yürüttüğü mücadeleyle Türkiye demokrasi mücadelesinin lokomotifi oldu.
In 2014, he ran against Erdogan for president, and he received almost 10% of the votes, which is a huge success for a left-leaning Kurdish politician. In 2015, in general elections, the first pro-Kurdish party entered parliament by passing the parliamentary threshold. Erdogan's single-party majority ended, and months after this election, Selahattin Demirtas, along with several other Kurdish politicians, was arrested and sent to jail for terror charges.
It was 2016, the same year when an attempted coup d'etat by the army against Erdogan's government prompted a mass crackdown on independent voices. Tens of thousands were arrested. Demirtas was one of them.
This couldn't really stop him. He continued to write books in jail and continued to speak to news outlets through his lawyers.
Halk TV emekçileri sordu. Edirne F tipinden Selahattin Demirtas cevapladı.
And he even ran for president again against Erdogan from the prison.
Ocalan used to represent militancy and Demirtas change through democratic process. But after that election, he declared his exit from politics. Both are still in jail. Ocalan's latest call is for the PKK to lay down its arms and disband entirely. But the ultimate outcome of decades of violent conflicts remains unclear. While Kurdish movements in Turkey have abandoned their old goal of a state, in Iraq and Syria, Kurds have come the closest they ever have to full autonomy, albeit under threat. We'll be discussing that in our next episode. Thanks to our guides J.R. Gol, Dilay Yalchin, Sarbas Nazari, Florence Dixon and Mohammed Al-Jumaili. The producers of this episode are Barry Sadid and Krista Shaturi. The sound has been mixed by Nigel Dix, our editor is Judy King, and I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig.